My name is Amanda Wilcox. I'm 35 years old, and this is the story of how my brother died hiding a secret until I went to the cabin he never wanted me near. 3 weeks after we buried David, I found a handwritten note tucked inside his old jacket that simply read, "Amanda, stay away from the cabin, please." Those words haunted me because my brother never kept secrets from me, or at least that's what I thought. The funeral was barely over, and I was already questioning everything I knew about the person I trusted most in this world. If you've ever lost someone and discovered they weren't who you thought they were, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because what I'm about to share will shock you. Have you ever been left with questions that only the dead could answer? Let me know in the comments because I need to know I'm not alone in this. But here's the thing that made my blood run cold. The cabin wasn't just some random place. It was the one location David warned me about every single time we talked, and now I understand why. The note wasn't the only thing I found that day. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in David's bedroom, there was a metal box I'd never seen before, locked tight with a combination I didn't know. My hands were shaking as I held it, feeling the weight of secrets pressing down on me like a physical force. Inside that box, I knew there would be answers, but I also knew those answers would change everything. You won't believe what happened next. But first, let me take you back to where this nightmare really began. I drove for 3 hours through winding mountain roads to reach the cabin, and with every mile, David's warning echoed louder in my mind. The trees seemed to close in around me as I got closer, like nature itself was trying to keep me away from whatever truth waited at the end of that gravel path. My daughter, Sophie, was staying with my mom for the week because something deep inside told me this journey wasn't safe for a 10-year-old. The guilt of leaving her behind mixed with the fear of what I might discover, creating a knot in my stomach that tightened with each turn. But I had to know why my brother, my best friend, the man who raised me after our parents died, would keep something so important hidden from me. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it looked exactly like the photo I'd found in David's box, the one with "Do not go here" written on the back in his handwriting. The structure was old, maybe 70 or 80 years, with peeling paint and windows so dirty I couldn't see inside. There were no neighbors for miles, just dense forest and the sound of wind whipping through the pines. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, staring at that front door, wondering if opening it would destroy the memory of my brother forever. Have you ever stood at the edge of a truth you weren't sure you wanted to face? That's where I was, caught between love for who David was and terror of who he might have been. The key was in the metal box, along with documents I hadn't fully read yet, because I was too focused on getting here. My hands trembled as I slid it into the lock, and I swear I heard David's voice in my head saying, "Amanda, please don't." But I turned it anyway, and the door creaked open like something out of a horror movie, revealing darkness that seemed to swallow the afternoon light. The smell hit me first, musty and old, mixed with something else I couldn't quite place, something that made my skin crawl. I stepped inside, and my eyes slowly adjusted to reveal a single room with a table, a chair, and walls covered in newspaper clippings and photographs. Every single article on those walls was about our family, going back decades before David and I were even born. There were photos of our grandparents, people I'd only seen in old albums, standing in front of this very cabin with expressions that looked nothing like the happy family stories we'd been told. One clipping from 1987 showed a headline, "Local family involved in land dispute scandal." Another from 1992 read, "Inheritance battle turns ugly for prominent family." I felt my legs go weak as I realized David hadn't just been keeping a secret. He'd been protecting me from an entire hidden history. The cabin wasn't just a place. It was a vault, containing everything our family wanted buried, and my brother had carried that burden alone. But that's when I noticed the journal sitting on the table, covered in dust but clearly placed there deliberately, like David knew someone would eventually find it. The first page had my name written in his handwriting. "Amanda, if you're reading this, I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive." My vision blurred with tears as I picked it up, knowing that the next pages would either give me closure or shatter everything I believed about my family. What I discovered in that journal would lead me down a path of betrayal, hidden money, and family members I thought I could trust. You won't believe what David had been protecting me from all these years, and why he thought dying with the secret was better than telling me the truth. I spent the next 4 hours reading David's journal by the dim light filtering through those dirty windows, and every page felt like a punch to the gut. The journal started 20 years ago, right after our parents died in that car accident we were told was just bad luck and icy roads. But according to David's notes, The accident happened 3 days after our father discovered something about our grandfather's business dealings, something involving this cabin and land rights worth millions. My hands shook as I read his words. Dad was going to expose everything, and then he was gone. David never wrote the word murder, but the implication hung heavy on every page, and I felt sick realizing my brother had lived with this suspicion his entire adult life. The deeper I read, the more I understood why David pushed me away from anything related to our extended family. Our Uncle Richard, Dad's brother, had been managing the family estate since our parents died, always telling us there was barely anything left after debts and funeral costs. But David had discovered documents showing properties, investments, and this cabin, all registered under shell companies that traced back to Richard and our grandfather's old business partner, a man named Thomas Crawford. For 2 decades, David had been quietly investigating, collecting evidence, trying to figure out if our parents' death was truly an accident or something far more sinister. He wrote about sleepless nights, about wanting to tell me but fearing what might happen if the wrong people knew he was digging into the past. One entry from 5 years ago broke my heart completely. Amanda called today asking why I never come to family gatherings anymore. I wanted to tell her that sitting across from Richard makes me want to scream, knowing what he might have done. But how do I explain that without proof? How do I destroy her life with suspicions I can't prove? I had been so angry at David for becoming distant, for missing Sophie's birthdays and Christmas dinners, never understanding he was sacrificing our relationship to protect me. The guilt washed over me in waves because I'd spent years resenting him, thinking he'd chosen isolation over family, when really he'd been drowning in secrets too dangerous to share. If you've ever misjudged someone you loved, only to learn the truth too late, you know exactly how I felt in that moment. The journal revealed that David had finally found concrete evidence 6 months before he died, a safety deposit box number and a key taped to the inside back cover. He'd written, "This box contains everything. The original will, the land deeds, proof of what Richard did. If something happens to me, Amanda needs to know the cabin is legally hers, not his. Grandfather left it specifically to our father, and then to us, but Richard forged documents to claim it." My brother had been planning to tell me everything, to finally bring this nightmare into the light, but he died 2 weeks before our scheduled meeting. The doctors said it was a heart attack, sudden and unexpected for a healthy 40-year-old, and now I couldn't stop wondering if that timing was really just coincidence. But the final entry in the journal changed everything I thought I knew about my brother's death. Written just 3 days before he died, David's handwriting was shaky and urgent. "I think they know I've been asking questions. Richard showed up at my office today with Crawford, asking about family business and whether I'd been to the cabin lately. I told them no, but Richard smiled in a way that made my blood run cold. He said, 'Good, because that place has bad memories, and some things are better left forgotten. I'm going to the lawyer tomorrow to put everything in motion. If anything happens to me, Amanda will get the evidence automatically. They can't stop this anymore.'" Reading those words, I realized my brother hadn't died of natural causes. He'd been silenced, and the people responsible were still out there, probably thinking the secrets died with him. What they didn't know was that David had prepared for this exact scenario, and I was about to become the biggest threat they never saw coming. I left the cabin that evening with David's journal clutched to my chest, and a fire burning inside me that I'd never felt before. The safety deposit box key was now hanging around my neck on a chain, hidden under my shirt where no one could see it. During the 3-hour drive home, I kept checking my rearview mirror, paranoid that Richard or Crawford might somehow know I'd been to the cabin, might be following me right now. Every pair of headlights behind me felt like a threat, and I realized this was how David had lived for 20 years, constantly looking over his shoulder, trusting no one. The difference was that I had something he never had. I had nothing left to lose, because the person I loved most was already gone. Before I even made it home, I pulled over at a rest stop and called the bank David had mentioned in his journal. My voice was steady as I explained I needed to access my brother's safety deposit box, that I had the key and his death certificate. The woman on the phone said I'd need to come in person with proper identification and proof of legal authority, which meant I needed to move fast before Richard found out what I was doing. If you're watching this and you've ever had to fight for the truth against people with power and money, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story is about to get intense. Have you ever had to become someone you never thought you'd be just to survive? Because that's exactly what happened to me in the weeks that followed. The next morning, I went straight to David's lawyer, a man named Vincent Hayes who'd handled our parents' estate 20 years ago. Vincent was in his 70s now, with kind eyes that widened when I told him why I was there. He leaned back in his leather chair and said something that made my stomach drop. "Amanda, your brother came to see me 2 weeks before he died. He set up a contingency plan in case anything happened to him." Vincent pulled out a sealed envelope with my name on it and explained that David had created a trust, naming me as the sole beneficiary and trustee of all assets he'd discovered, including the cabin. But there was more. David had also given Vincent copies of every document he'd found, with instructions to release them to me upon his death. As Vincent spread the papers across his desk, I saw the full scope of what David had uncovered. The original will from our grandfather, dated 1985, clearly left the cabin and surrounding 300 acres to our father, with explicit instructions that it should pass to his children. But there was a second will, dated just 2 weeks after the first, leaving everything to Richard instead, and David had found proof that grandfather's signature on the second will was forged. The handwriting analysis, done by a certified expert, showed clear differences in pen pressure, letter formation, and signature flow. Richard had stolen our inheritance, and he'd done it with the help of Thomas Crawford, who happened to be the lawyer who'd witnessed the second will. But the most damaging evidence was a series of bank transfers Vincent showed me, moving money from what should have been our trust fund into accounts controlled by Richard and Crawford. Over the past 20 years, they'd siphoned off nearly $4 million, selling timber rights, leasing mineral rights, and even renting the cabin out to hunting groups, all while telling David and me that our family had nothing left. Vincent looked at me with genuine concern and said, "Your brother wanted you to have this information, but he also wanted me to warn you. These men are dangerous, Amanda. David believed they might have been involved in your parents' death, though he could never prove it. If you're going to pursue this, you need to be very careful." I looked at those documents and felt something shift inside me, a determination that scared me, because I'd never been a fighter. I'd always been the peacemaker, the one who avoided conflict. But David had died protecting me, and I wasn't going to let that be for nothing. Vincent helped me access David's safety deposit box 2 days later, and what I found inside made everything else look like child's play. There were 3 envelopes, each labeled with a different name: mine, Sophie's, and one simply marked evidence. My hands trembled as I opened the one with my name, finding a letter from David dated the week before he died. "Dear Amanda," it began, "if you're reading this, then my worst fears have come true. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from this truth, but you deserve to know who our family really is." The letter went on to explain that he'd discovered our grandfather had been involved in illegal land deals in the 1970s, using the cabin as a meeting place for bribes and under-the-table agreements that made him wealthy beyond what anyone knew. David's letter revealed that our father had found out about these crimes and was planning to turn everything over to the authorities when he died. "Dad wasn't a saint, Amanda," David wrote, "but he wanted to make things right. He was going to return the land to the family's grandfather stole it from, even if it meant we'd lose everything. That's why Richard had him killed. I'm certain of it now." Reading those words, I had to put the letter down, because I couldn't breathe. Our uncle, the man who'd bounced me on his knee as a child, who'd given me away at my wedding, had murdered his own brother. The evidence was circumstantial, David admitted, but the timing was too perfect, the accident too convenient, and Richard's sudden control of the estate too suspicious to ignore. The envelope marked evidence contained something even more shocking: a recorded conversation between Richard and Thomas Crawford from 3 months before David died. My brother had somehow managed to bug Richard's office, and the recording was damning. I listened to it right there in the bank's private room, with Vincent beside me taking notes. Richard's voice came through clearly. "David's been asking questions about the cabin again. He went to the county records office last week, pulled all the original deeds." Crawford responded, "We should have dealt with this 20 years ago when we dealt with his father. The kid's too smart for his own good." Richard laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Well, maybe it's time for another family tragedy. Heart problems run in families, you know." I felt Vincent's hand on my shoulder as I sat there, frozen, listening to these men casually discuss murdering my brother like it was a business decision. The recording continued with them talking about how they'd made David's death look natural, how they'd paid off a medical examiner to rule it as natural causes without a full autopsy. "The sister's not a problem," Richard said on the tape. "She doesn't know anything, and she's too busy with that kid to pay attention to family business." Hearing him dismiss me like that, hearing the contempt in his voice, made something inside me snap. They'd killed my parents, they'd killed my brother, and they thought I was too stupid or too weak to figure it out. But David's final gift to me was in the third envelope, the one addressed to Sophie. Inside was a new will, properly witnessed and notarized, leaving everything to me as Sophie's guardian until she turned 25. More importantly, it included a detailed confession of everything David had discovered, written in a way that would hold up in court. Vincent explained that David had been building a legal case, not just collecting evidence for personal knowledge. Your brother was 3 weeks away from filing a lawsuit when he died, Vincent said. He'd lined up witnesses, expert testimony, everything needed to prove fraud, forgery, and theft. With this recording added to the evidence, we now have enough to suggest murder. The weight of that statement hit me like a truck, because I wasn't just fighting for money or property anymore. I was fighting to get justice for my entire family, and that meant going to war with people who'd already killed 3 times. I made copies of everything before I left the bank, storing the originals in a second safety deposit box under Sophie's name, with instructions that only she could access them if something happened to me. Vincent warned me that once I confronted Richard, there would be no going back, that I needed to be prepared for a legal battle that could take years and cost everything I had. But I was done being careful, done being the quiet niece who never asked questions. That evening, I called Richard and asked him to meet me at a coffee shop downtown, keeping my voice normal and casual like nothing was wrong. He agreed immediately, probably thinking I wanted to talk about David's funeral expenses or sorting through his apartment, never imagining that I knew the truth. When Richard walked into that coffee shop 2 days later, he looked exactly like the uncle I remembered. Gray hair, perfectly styled, expensive suit, warm smile that had fooled me my entire life. He hugged me, offered condolences about David, and ordered us both coffee while asking about Sophie and how I was holding up. I let him play his part for about 5 minutes before I slid a folder across the table containing copies of the forged will, the bank transfers, and a transcript of the recorded conversation. If you've stayed with me this far, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because what happened next is something I'll never forget. Have you ever watched someone's mask slip in real time? Because that's exactly what I witnessed as Richard opened that folder. His face went from concerned uncle to something cold and calculating in less than 3 seconds. He didn't even pretend to be confused or ask what this was about, which told me everything I needed to know. Amanda, he said slowly, closing the folder. You don't understand what you're looking at. Your brother was paranoid, seeing conspiracies where there were none. I leaned forward and said, then explain the recording, Richard. Explain you and Crawford discussing David's death before it happened. Explain the forged signature on grandfather's will. His jaw tightened, and I saw his hand shake slightly as he picked up his coffee cup. That recording could be edited, manipulated. You're playing a dangerous game here, and you're going to lose. But I was ready for his threats because Vincent had coached me on exactly what to say. I've already filed a civil lawsuit claiming fraud and theft. The police have copies of everything, including the recording. A forensic accountant is going through 20 years of financial records, and I've hired a private investigator to look into Mom and Dad's accident. That last part was a bluff. I hadn't hired anyone yet, but I wanted to see his reaction. Richard's face turned red, and he leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You have no idea what you're starting. David thought he was smart too, and look where that got him. You have a daughter to think about, Amanda. Accidents happen all the time, especially to people who don't know when to leave things alone. The fact that he just threatened Sophie's life in a public place showed me how desperate and dangerous he really was. I stood up, my legs surprisingly steady despite my racing heart, and said loud enough for nearby tables to hear, Are you threatening my daughter, Uncle Richard? Because I'm recording this conversation, and I think the police would be very interested to hear you make threats after I've accused you of murder. His eyes widened as I pulled out my phone from my pocket, the recording app clearly visible on the screen. The people at the next table were staring now, and Richard knew he'd made a mistake. He stood up quickly, knocking his chair back, and walked out without another word. But not before I saw something in his eyes that made my blood run cold. The look of someone who'd already decided what he had to do next, and it wasn't backing down. That night, I couldn't sleep. So I sat in Sophie's room watching her breathe, realizing that every decision I made from here on out would affect her life forever. I kept replaying moments from my childhood, seeing them through this new lens of truth that made everything look different. The way Richard always showed up at our house right after Dad died, taking charge of everything before we could even process our grief. How he'd sold our parents' house within 2 months, telling us it was necessary to pay debts that I now knew didn't exist. The family gatherings where he'd steer conversations away whenever anyone mentioned grandfather's business or asked about the cabin. All these moments I'd dismissed as him being helpful or protective were actually him controlling the narrative, making sure David and I never looked too closely at our family history. I thought about David too, about all those years he carried this burden alone because he was trying to protect me. The distance between us that I'd resented so much now made perfect sense. He couldn't sit at family dinners pretending everything was fine when he suspected Richard had killed our parents. Every missed birthday, every holiday he skipped, every time he made excuses not to visit, it wasn't because he didn't love us. It was because he loved us too much to put us in danger. I remembered the last conversation we had, 3 weeks before he died, when he'd said, "Amanda, I need to tell you something important. Can we meet next month?" I'd been annoyed because next month seemed so far away. I'd wanted to talk right then. Now I understood he needed time to prepare, to make sure everything was documented and safe before he revealed the truth. The guilt of not understanding him when he was alive ate at me in those dark hours. I'd accused him of being selfish, of abandoning his family, of choosing loneliness over the people who loved him. My last words to him had been frustrated. "Fine, David. Whenever you're ready to actually be part of this family again, let me know." He'd died 2 days later, and I never got to apologize, never got to tell him I loved him, never got to say I understood. That regret was a physical weight on my chest, making it hard to breathe as I realized he'd spent his final days knowing I was angry with him, knowing I thought he didn't care, when the opposite was true. But sitting there in Sophie's room, watching moonlight filter through her curtains, I also felt something else growing alongside the grief, a fierce determination to finish what David started. He'd spent 20 years gathering evidence, sacrificing his relationship with me and his own happiness to build a case that could bring Richard down. The least I could do was see it through, make sure his death meant something, make sure our parents' deaths were finally investigated properly. I thought about the kind of person I'd been before all this, someone who avoided conflict, who believed the best in people, who thought family was everything. That Amanda was gone now, replaced by someone harder, someone willing to fight, someone who understood that sometimes family is exactly what you need to fight against. As dawn broke and Sophie started to wake up, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to wait for the legal system to slowly work its way through evidence and depositions. I was going to force Richard's hand, make him desperate enough to make mistakes, and I knew exactly how to do it. But what I didn't know was that Richard was already 3 steps ahead of me, and the next few weeks would test everything I thought I knew about courage, revenge, and how far I was willing to go to protect the people I loved. The war between us was about to get very personal, very ugly, and very dangerous. The week after confronting Richard, I decided to dig deeper into David's life, searching his apartment for anything else he might have hidden. His landlord let me in with a sad smile, saying David had always been a good tenant, quiet, and paid his rent on time. Walking through his space felt like visiting a museum of my brother's secret life, every item telling a story I'd never known. His walls were covered with maps of our grandfather's properties, photographs of the cabin from different angles, and a timeline he'd created spanning 50 years of our family's history. It was the workspace of someone obsessed, someone who'd let this investigation consume every moment of his free time. In his desk drawer, I found letters David had written to me but never sent, dozens of them dating back years. My hands shook as I read through them, each one starting with an apology and an explanation he never had the courage to give in person. One from 5 years ago said, "Dear Amanda, I saw Sophie's birthday photos on social media today. She's getting so big, and I hate that I'm missing these moments. But every time I think about coming to visit, I imagine Richard showing up, asking questions, getting suspicious about why I'm suddenly around more. I can't risk putting you and Sophie in danger just because I'm lonely." Another from 2 years ago. "I drove by your house today but didn't stop. I sat in my car for an hour, watching through your window as you helped Sophie with homework, and I cried because I want that life so badly, but I can't have it until this is finished." Reading those letters destroyed me, because I finally understood the full cost of what Richard had stolen from us. It wasn't just money or property. It was 20 years of family dinners, 20 years of birthday parties, 20 years of David being Uncle David to Sophie, instead of a distant figure she barely knew. Richard had killed our parents, but he'd also killed the life David should have had, forcing him into isolation and paranoia that ended with his death at 40. If you're still watching, Please hit that subscribe button and like this video, because the story gets even more intense from here. Have you ever discovered that someone you loved had been suffering in silence, protecting you from a truth they carried alone? That's the guilt I was drowning in, as I read letter after letter of David's pain. But then I found something that changed everything. A USB drive taped to the bottom of his desk drawer with insurance written on it in marker. I plugged it into David's laptop, and what I saw made my stomach drop. It was surveillance footage from the cabin. Dozens of videos showing Richard and Crawford meeting there over the past 3 years. In the videos, they were discussing their illegal operations, not just the old crimes, but new ones, using the cabin as a hub for money laundering and fraud schemes that were still active. David had installed hidden cameras throughout the cabin without them knowing, collecting evidence of ongoing criminal activity that went far beyond the inheritance theft. One video from 6 months ago showed Richard and Crawford with a third man I didn't recognize, talking about the David problem and how to handle it. The stranger said, "Make it look natural, heart attack or stroke, something that won't raise questions. He's been to 3 different doctors in the past year for stress, so it won't seem suspicious." Richard nodded and replied, "My contact at the hospital can handle it." A little adjustment to his medication, increase the dosage of his blood pressure pills without him knowing, and nature will take its course. I watched them plan my brother's murder in detail, discussing it like it was a simple business transaction, and I felt something break inside me that could never be fixed. This wasn't just evidence anymore. This was proof of premeditated murder, and it was going to destroy Richard's life the same way he'd destroyed ours. I sat in David's apartment for hours after watching those videos, trying to process what this meant for Sophie and me. With this evidence, I could destroy Richard completely, send him to prison for the rest of his life, and reclaim everything he'd stolen from our family. But I also knew that the moment I turned this over to the police, our lives would never be normal again. Sophie would grow up knowing her great-uncle murdered her grandparents and uncle, that her family history was built on lies and violence. We'd be dragged through years of trials, media attention, and the constant fear that Richard might have other dangerous people willing to silence us before the case went to court. The responsible thing, the safe thing, would have been to take this evidence straight to Vincent and let him handle everything through proper legal channels. But another part of me, a darker part I didn't know existed until David died, wanted revenge that went beyond courtrooms and prison sentences. I wanted Richard to feel the fear David had lived with for 20 years, wanted him to understand what it meant to lose everything you'd built on the backs of dead family members. My mother had raised me to believe in justice and forgiveness, but my mother had been murdered by her brother-in-law, and I wasn't sure her values applied to this situation anymore. That night, I called my best friend Sarah, the only person outside of Vincent who knew what was happening. She came over immediately, and we sat on my couch while Sophie slept upstairs, drinking wine and talking about choices I never thought I'd have to make. Sarah looked at me with worried eyes and said, "Amanda, I know you want revenge, but you have to think about Sophie. What happens to her if you do something illegal and end up in jail? What happens if you push too hard and Richard comes after her to get to you?" Her words hit me like cold water because she was right. My daughter was the one innocent person in all of this, and every decision I made had to put her safety first. But then Sarah said something that changed my perspective. "However, you also have to think about all the other people Richard and Crawford might hurt if they keep operating. David's evidence shows they're still running scams, still stealing from people. If you don't stop them, who will? How many more families will they destroy?" That's when I realized this wasn't just about revenge or justice for my family anymore. It was about ending a criminal operation that had been running for decades. I had the power to stop them, and with that power came responsibility I couldn't ignore, even if I wanted to. I made my decision that night, sitting on my couch with Sarah beside me and Sophie sleeping upstairs. I would go to the police with everything, but not before I made sure Richard knew it was coming. Not before I looked him in the eye and told him that David had won, that his little niece wasn't as stupid or weak as he'd thought. I wanted him to have time to panic, to make mistakes, to feel the walls closing in the way David had felt them closing in before he died. It was petty, maybe even dangerous, but I needed him to know that he'd underestimated me, and that underestimation was going to cost him everything. What I didn't realize was that by giving him that warning, I was about to trigger a chain of events that would put Sophie and me in more danger than I could have imagined. I spent the next 2 days planning my approach with military precision, something David had taught me when we were kids playing strategy games together. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using lessons from happier times to destroy the man who'd stolen those times from us. I made copies of all the USB footage, storing them in 3 different locations, one with Vincent, one with Sarah, and one in a cloud storage account that would automatically send everything to the FBI if I didn't log in every 72 hours. I wasn't taking any chances, because if Richard had killed 3 people already, a 4th wouldn't weigh heavily on his conscience. On Wednesday morning, I sent Richard a single text message. I found David's cameras at the cabin. I have everything. Meet me there tomorrow at noon, alone, or the police get the videos. I didn't wait for his response before turning off my phone and taking Sophie to stay with Sarah's parents 3 hours away, telling her it was a special surprise visit. Sophie was confused why I couldn't stay too, why I seemed so tense and kept checking the windows. But she was 10 and easily distracted by Sarah's mom's promise of baking cookies. Leaving her there was the hardest thing I'd done yet, because I knew there was a chance I wouldn't make it back from this meeting, that Richard might decide killing me was easier than facing justice. If you've made it this far in my story, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because what happened at that cabin meeting is something I'll never forget. Have you ever walked into a situation knowing you might not walk out, but doing it anyway because some things are worth the risk? That's exactly where I was as I drove back to that mountain cabin the next day, with pepper spray in my pocket, my phone recording in my purse, and Vincent on speed dial with instructions to call the police if he didn't hear from me by 2 p.m. I arrived at the cabin 30 minutes early, wanting to check David's cameras and make sure they were still recording. What I found made my blood run cold. Someone had been there recently. Cigarette butts outside that weren't there before, fresh tire tracks in the dirt. Richard had already come to the cabin, probably looking for the cameras, maybe planning an ambush. I almost turned around right then, almost got back in my car and drove straight to the police station. But then I thought about David spending his last days afraid, thought about my parents dying without justice, and I stayed. Richard showed up exactly at noon, but he wasn't alone. Thomas Crawford was with him, and they pulled up in Crawford's black SUV with tinted windows that screamed, "Nothing good happens here." I watched from inside the cabin as they got out, Richard looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen him, Crawford scanning the area like he expected an ambush. They walked to the cabin door, and I opened it before they could knock, standing in the doorway with my phone obviously recording. "I said alone, Richard," I called out loud enough for my phone to catch clearly. Richard's face was hard as stone when he said, "Whatever you think you know, Amanda, you're wrong, and you're making a mistake that's going to cost you everything." I stepped aside and let them into the cabin, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Richard walked in first, his eyes immediately scanning the walls and ceiling, looking for the cameras he now knew were there. Crawford followed, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded too final, too threatening. "Where's the kid?" Crawford asked, and something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I kept my voice steady as I replied, "Somewhere you'll never find her, and if anything happens to me, 5 people have instructions to call the police immediately." It was a bluff. There weren't 5 people, but they didn't need to know that. Richard sat down at the table where I'd first read David's journal, and the symbolism wasn't lost on any of us. "You wanted to talk, so talk," he said, folding his hands in front of him like we were having a normal family discussion. I pulled out my phone and played the video of them discussing David's murder, watching Richard's face as his own voice filled the cabin. A little adjustment to his medication, and nature will take its course. The color drained from his face, and Crawford moved toward me quickly, but I held up my hand. "Touch me and this video goes live to the FBI, the local police, and every news station in the state. It's set up automatically." Crawford stopped, and I saw something pass between him and Richard, some unspoken communication that told me they'd already discussed what to do if I had real evidence. Richard's voice was cold when he finally spoke. "What do you want, Amanda? Money? We can arrange a payment, call it a settlement for the inheritance dispute. You get the cabin, you get a lump sum, and we all walk away from this." I almost laughed at how quickly he'd gone from denying everything to trying to buy me off. "I don't want your money, Richard. I want you in prison for the rest of your life. I want everyone to know you murdered your own brother, your sister-in-law, and your nephew. I want David's name cleared, and his story told." Richard's expression shifted then, from calculating to genuinely angry, and I saw the man he really was underneath the uncle mask he'd worn my whole life. "You self-righteous little fool," he hissed, standing up so fast his chair fell backward. "You think you're some kind of hero? You think David was innocent in all this? He knew about grandfather's deals. He benefited from that money just like everyone else. But suddenly he wanted to play saint and ruin everything we'd built. His words confused me because David's journals had never mentioned knowing about the crimes before our parents died. Richard saw my confusion and laughed bitterly. "Oh, he didn't tell you that part? Your precious brother spent the inheritance money, bought his fancy apartment, took expensive vacations, and never asked where it came from until it was convenient for his conscience." Crawford put a hand on Richard's shoulder, trying to calm him down, but Richard shook it off. "You want the truth, Amanda? Your father was going to destroy this family over crimes that happened before you were even born. He was going to give everything back, leave us with nothing, make us look like criminals for things grandfather did. So yes, I stopped him. And yes, I stopped David when he decided to do the same thing. And I'll stop you too if that's what it takes to protect what's mine." The confession hung in the air between us, and I realized he'd just admitted to murder while I was recording. But I also realized something else. He didn't care anymore, because he'd already decided I wasn't leaving this cabin alive. The moment I saw Crawford reach into his jacket, everything David had taught me about survival kicked in. I ran for the back door I'd unlocked earlier as my backup escape, hearing Richard yell, "Stop her!" behind me. My hands fumbled with the doorknob for a second that felt like an eternity, before I burst outside into the forest behind the cabin. Branches scratched my face as I ran through the trees. My phone clutched in my hand, praying the recording had uploaded to the cloud before I'd lost signal. Behind me, I could hear Crawford crashing through the undergrowth, and I realized this was it. This was how David had felt in his final days, running from men who wanted him dead. But then I heard something beautiful. Sirens in the distance, getting closer. I'd forgotten about Vincent's instruction to call police if I didn't check in, and when 2 p.m. had come and gone without word from me, he'd done exactly what I'd asked. I kept running toward the sound, screaming, "Help! I'm here!" at the top of my lungs. Crawford must have heard the sirens too, because the crashing behind me stopped, and when I finally burst out onto the main road, 3 police cars were pulling up to the cabin. I collapsed on the gravel driveway, gasping for breath, as officers rushed past me toward the cabin. One young officer stayed with me, asking if I was hurt, if I needed medical attention, while I tried to explain between sobs what had just happened. They arrested Richard and Crawford within minutes, finding Crawford's gun still in his jacket, and my phone recording still active in my pocket, having captured everything including Richard's confession, and their attempt to chase me down. The lead detective, a woman named Sarah Chen, sat with me in her car while I gave my initial statement. She told me they'd been investigating Crawford for fraud for 6 months, but hadn't had enough evidence to move forward, and that my video footage and recordings would break the case wide open. "Your brother would be proud," she said softly, and I broke down completely, finally letting out all the fear and grief I'd been holding in since David died. The next few weeks were a blur of police interviews, FBI involvement once the money laundering evidence came to light, and media attention I wasn't prepared for. Our family's story made headlines. Local businessman arrested for nephew's murder. Decades-long inheritance fraud exposed. Woman brings down criminal uncle with brother's hidden evidence. I hated seeing our pain turned into entertainment, but Detective Chen reminded me that publicity made it harder for Richard to make any deals or escape justice. Sophie came home after the arrests, and I had to explain to my 10-year-old daughter that her great-uncle was a bad man who'd hurt our family, watching her process information no child should have to hear. But something unexpected happened during those difficult weeks. I started to feel lighter, like a weight I didn't know I was carrying had been lifted. The constant fear that had consumed me since finding David's journal was gone, replaced by a strange sense of peace. I'd done what David couldn't. I'd finished his mission, and brought our family's killers to justice. More than that, I'd proven to myself that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, that I could face evil and survive. One night, sitting in Sophie's room watching her sleep like I had so many times before, I whispered to David's memory, "I forgive you for keeping secrets. I understand now why you did it, and I hope wherever you are, you finally have peace too." Saying those words out loud felt like letting go of the anger and resentment I'd carried, allowing myself to remember my brother as the protector he was, rather than the distant figure he'd seemed to be. The trial took 8 months to reach its conclusion, and I sat in that courtroom every single day, watching Richard and Crawford try to defend the indefensible. Their lawyers argued that the recordings were obtained illegally, that David had been unstable and paranoid, that I was a grieving woman looking for someone to blame for a natural death. But the evidence was overwhelming. The forged will, the financial records, the surveillance footage, my recordings of Richard's confession, and most damning of all, the autopsy they performed on David's exhumed body, showing lethal levels of medication in his system. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding them both guilty on all counts. 2 counts of first-degree murder for my parents, 1 count for David, multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and money laundering. When the judge sentenced Richard to 3 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph or satisfaction, but sadness. This man had been part of my family, had held me as a baby, had been at every important moment of my early life, and he'd thrown it all away for money and pride. Crawford got 2 life sentences, and as they led both men out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Richard looked at me one last time. I thought I'd see hatred in his eyes, but instead, I saw something worse. Regret. Not regret for killing people, but regret for getting caught, for underestimating the niece he'd dismissed as weak and ignorant. That look told me everything I needed to know about who he really was, and it made forgiving myself for what I'd had to do much easier. The legal victory meant the cabin and all the properties Richard had stolen reverted to me as David's heir, along with the $4 million he'd embezzled, plus interest and damages. Suddenly, Sophie and I went from struggling to pay bills to having more money than I knew what to do with. My first decision was easy. I hired a private investigator to track down the families grandfather had cheated in his original land deals. Some had died, some had moved away, but I found 7 families who'd lost property or money to my grandfather's schemes, and I made it right. I couldn't give them back the decades they'd lost, but I could give them what was owed plus interest, and watching their faces when they realized someone was actually trying to fix an old wrong was worth more than any amount of money. The cabin itself became something unexpected, a memorial and a lesson. I donated it to a local nonprofit that works with families dealing with inheritance fraud and elder abuse, turning David's prison into a place that helps people avoid the same traps our family fell into. They renamed it the David Wilcox Justice Center, and every time I drive past and see his name on that sign, I feel proud of who my brother was and what he sacrificed. Sophie is 13 now, old enough to understand the full story, and she talks about becoming a lawyer someday to help people like her uncle tried to help our family. She never got to really know David, but his legacy lives through her determination to fight for what's right. I learned something profound through this nightmare that changed how I see the world. Secrets are poison that destroy families from the inside out, and the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than living a lie. David spent 20 years carrying secrets that killed him, and if he'd trusted me sooner, if we'd faced this together, maybe he'd still be alive today. But I also learned that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage when protecting the people they love, that you don't know how strong you are until strength is your only option. I was a single mom who avoided conflict and believed the best in people, and I became someone who could face down killers and survive. That transformation didn't make me harder or colder. It made me more aware of what really matters: truth, family, and leaving the world a little bit better than you found I. So after hearing my story, what would you have done in my place? Would you have gone to the police immediately? Or would you have confronted Richard like I did, risking everything for the chance to look him in the eye and make him face what he'd done? I think about that question a lot, wondering if I made the right choices, or if my need for revenge almost cost me and Sophie everything. The truth is, there's no perfect answer, because when you're living through trauma and betrayal, you make decisions based on emotion and survival instinct, not logic and careful planning. But I do know this: staying silent would have been worse than any risk I took, because silence is what allowed Richard to kill 3 people and get away with it for decades. If you've made it to the end of my story, first of all, thank you for listening and for being part of this journey with me. Please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because I have more stories to share about what happened after the trial, about rebuilding my relationship with Sophie, and about the other victims of Richard and Crawford's schemes who came forward once the news broke. Your support means everything, and knowing that my story might help someone else find the courage to stand up to family corruption or seek justice for a loved one makes sharing these painful memories worthwhile. Drop a like on this video if you believe that truth and justice matter, even when they come at a terrible cost. Here's the question I want you to think about and answer in the comments. Do you believe some secrets should stay buried to protect family peace? Or is the truth always worth pursuing no matter what it destroys? I used to believe that family was sacred, that you protected your own no matter what. But David's death taught me that not all family deserves protection. Some people hide behind the word family while committing terrible acts, expecting loyalty to shield them from consequences. Richard played that card throughout his trial, telling the jury that I was a traitor to my own blood, that David had betrayed the family by investigating grandfather's crimes. But blood doesn't give you permission to murder, to steal, or to destroy lives. And loyalty to evil people isn't loyalty, it's complicity. The hardest lesson I learned through all of this is that revenge and justice aren't the same thing, even though they can look identical from the outside. I wanted revenge when I confronted Richard at the cabin, wanted him to suffer the way David suffered, the way I was suffering. But what I got was justice, a legal process that held him accountable and prevented him from hurting anyone else. Revenge would have been satisfying for a moment but empty afterward, while justice gave me something permanent, peace. I can look at myself in the mirror now and know I did the right thing, that I honored David's memory by finishing what he started, and that's worth more than any revenge fantasy. If you're dealing with family betrayal, inheritance disputes, or suspicions that someone you love was harmed by people you trusted, please learn from my mistakes. Don't wait, don't try to handle it alone, and don't confront dangerous people without protection and backup. Get a lawyer, document everything, and trust the legal system even when it feels too slow or too weak to deliver justice. I got lucky that Richard confessed while I was recording, and that the police arrived in time to save my life, but I could have easily ended up as his fourth victim. Your life and safety are worth more than any amount of money or property, and dead heroes can't protect the people they leave behind. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video, where I'll talk about the warning signs I missed about Richard's true nature and how to spot family predators before they destroy your life. I'll see you in the next one. And remember, the truth might hurt, but lies kill.